O'Malley, a member of the Frederick County Nature Council, the sponsor of this webinar. The Frederick County Nature Council is a Friends of the Park group serving both Fountain Rock and Catoctin Creek Nature Parks in Frederick County by supporting the parks and improving the park experience for visitors. In addition to the quarterly webinar series, our activities include volunteering for park projects, organizing the annual Master Naturalist program for Fountain Rock, children's programs, collection of submissions for an anthology project, and holding a fall flower sale. Details for these activities can be found at the Nature Council's website, www.naturecouncilfc.org, and I'll put that in the chat once I'm done here. In addition, we are sponsoring a Fountain Rock Nature Center Cleanup Day this Saturday, June 8th, from 9:30 to 12:30. The weather prediction is for a beautiful day, so we hope you'll join us there. Our membership is open to the public, so please contact us if you are interested. Next, before I introduce our speaker, there are a couple of housekeeping items to cover. First, the session is being recorded, so please check to see that you are muted and that your camera is off. Second, during the webinar, please add your questions to the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and will direct your questions to Taylor during his presentation. And now for our speaker. We are excited to have Taylor Roman join us tonight to present Blossoms and Bees, exploring 150 million years of plant-pollinator evolution. Taylor is a farmer and an environmental educator who has lived and worked throughout Maryland his entire life. He's also a beekeeper for the DC office of the Best Bees Company. He speaks extensively, sharing his knowledge and his experiences with others. And so, Taylor, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Patty. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out and joining us. I'm happy to be here to speak to y'all. I recognize some names. Some of you might recognize me. Been engaged with Fountain Rock for a long time now. A lot of amazing stuff going on there, including with the Master Naturalist program. The last thing I'll do for my own introduction is positive reinforcement for all of us by establishing that other than when it comes to beekeeping, I am no professional about any of these topics. I am not a professional researcher. I am not published. I am just someone like you that has a fascination and passion for nature that will never be satisfied. And so I am endlessly trying to learn, and the beauty of nature and the interconnectedness of everything through ecology, that if you, like me, if you get really into plants, it's not long before you got to learn about a lot of other things that aren't plants. And tonight is a wonderful example of that. Talking about the plants that have shaped our world and the organisms, the pollinators, and a little bit specifically the bees that have been right along with them the entire time. This is a great exercise in stepping out of ourselves in order to think about things that aren't human. That's always a healthy challenge. Tonight we have the extra challenge of thinking about time scales that aren't human. In order to really understand flowering plants and the insects that have evolved with them, we have to go very far back in time. And so I've got some charts and other things to hopefully help us conceptualize this. But at the end of the night, if some of this is overwhelming, or if your mind is a little blown, good. That is the intention. And we're just going to have fun otherwise. So I'm going to share my screen so we can get this presentation going. Is that pulled up for everybody? Okay. What I have here is a picture of a landscape. And it honestly doesn't look that unusual. This This feels very familiar in a sense. This seems like a landscape that we could stumble upon somewhere in the world today while we're taking a hike. However, this is in fact a depiction. Oops, there we go. However, we are looking very far in the past. We are looking hundreds of millions of years into the past. This is an artist's depiction of what we think the landscape looked like during the Cretaceous period. It looks familiar because a lot of these plants look familiar. Indeed, a lot of these plants still exist today and have remained relatively unchanged for this long, unfathomable period of time, which only speaks to their success. The important reason that I bring up this picture, though, is that the vast majority of these plants, the types that I have circled here that still exist today, are not flowering plants. This is how far back in the past on planet Earth we have to go to get to a point where flowering plants don't exist. And therefore, the organisms, the animals, the pollinators that have specialized to partner with flowering plants don't exist yet. So this is how far back we have to go to find no flowers and no bees. All of these different plants that I have highlighted here have very successful life strategies, and they figured out, still being plants, still being stationary, how to breed with each other. We have examples like on the left, the liverworts, the mosses, the ferns. These are all organisms that figured out how to transport spores using water and wind. And so it's a real crapshoot. It's clearly successful, but still it's a crapshoot as an individual plant to replicate yourself and to just send it out into the world. Wait for that big rainstorm to wash away your spores, wait for that gust of wind to carry them away, and hope that they make it. And these were the organisms, or these were the plants that existed for a very long period of time. These are some of the earliest forms of plants that we can really appreciate. Both these liverworts, mosses, and ferns, the bryophytes and pteridophytes, fancy words to kind of define how their anatomy and how they reproduce. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll just appreciate that liverworts and mosses do not have vascular tissue, which is the word that we assign to plants that have tissue that essentially functions like veins in our body. Vascular tissue is able to move water from point A to point B inside the body of a plant. And so before vascular tissue existed, we had plants that were very low to the ground because they had to be somewhere where water was. If your body isn't in physical contact with water, you have no way to pull that water to you very successfully. And so you got to stay low and you got to stay wet. On the right-hand side here, we have different examples of gymnosperms. Conifers probably being the most widespread, the most familiar. Any kind of evergreen tree that you can think of, pines, spruces, firs, these are all examples of conifers. Conifers, horsetails, and cycads are a little bit further along in the evolution of plants. These are plants that have vascular tissue. This allows them to move water from point A to point B, such as from roots in the ground, all the way up stems, all the way up trunks, into a canopy. This was a huge game changer for plants. Suddenly, height could be conquered. Plants could grow up, they could grow tall, they could pull water in and put on way more biomass than they could before. And so this was a huge point of diversification in the history of plants when they figured out vascular tissue. This is what ultimately led to, among many other things, trees. as we know them. If you're going to be that tall, you got to have that vascular tissue to be able to move water all the way up to the top of that canopy. All of these conifers, horsetails, and cycads, they're not only a little bit further along in evolution because of their vascular tissue, but we see plants at this point adapting and evolving more and more to examples of sexual reproduction. That is to say, genetic material from two different individuals that has to come together in order to form a single new individual. And so we get pollen at this point. You can see the example of those immature pine cones being dusted with pollen from some other pine tree nearby. But we get now this, to us, very familiar behavior of sexual reproduction in plants, whereby pollen is released and it is picked up by another plant and taken in. That pollen carries sperm in it, and that sperm has to travel and meet an egg, and from there seeds are developed. And so big game changer, a lot more ability for plants to not only spread, as in grow in different places, but also spread up. And we have huge landscapes full of plants at this point. And we have lots of different gymnosperms that are still relying on water, but even more so now predominantly wind, to move pollen from one plant to another where it can be received. It's still very much a crapshoot. And so inevitably, the way that you as a gymnosperm get around that is you produce a ton of pollen. When it's time to reproduce, you want to coat the air with it. And as much as possible, maximize the chance that some of that pollen is going to float over to a neighbor and hit the right spot, find that egg that it can fertilize. Now, what do I mean by gymnosperms? This is probably familiar to a bunch of you, so I'll just go over it quickly. In our modern day, we tend to distinguish almost every plant, because almost every plant that we have ever seen or come in contact with falls into the category of a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. These Latin words translated roughly mean revealed seed or naked seed, versus a seed that is contained in a vessel, a protected seed. And so on the left here, we have, ignoring all of the other anatomy terms that are pointed out here, we are just looking at this single orange colored unit, and that is the seed. It is naked, and it will stay naked throughout its entire development. The easiest example of this in our world today is pine cones. On conifers, each scale of a cone has a single seed under it. And so when that cone was immature, it had open air access waiting for pollen to come and land on it and hit it. When that happens, the sperm within the pollen can be transferred directly into the egg that is open to the air, and that allows fertilization to occur. And then that egg can develop into a single seed. That seed has a coating on it, but we still consider it a completely naked seed. And it will be dumped into the environment that way. We juxtapose this to angiosperms, which are plants that have developed to cover and protect their seeds. We call this structure a carpel. That's a botanical term for it. What we would more commonly appreciate as this protective coating around the seeds would be fruit. And so on angiosperms, we have the carpel, which before seeds develop, we see the carpel as a flower. It's this big showy thing. It's got all of this anatomy that's specialized for reproduction. But at the base of a flower, you'll often see an enclosed bulbous or otherwise misshapen area. It looks different from the stem. And this is the carpel. This is where the ovaries of the plant exist. And this is what will ultimately develop into the fruit. Oftentimes, if you look throughout the progression of a flower turning into a fruit, or if you can find a nice time-lapse video, you will see that after the flower has been fertilized, the petals and other parts of the flower will be shed as this bulbous carpel underneath begins to swell and develop. And so over time, we quickly see the flower and all the reproductive parts that are no longer needed essentially falling away and making space for this carpel to get big and for these seeds within that carpel to develop. And so when we're talking about gymnosperms and angiosperms, there are, of course, other ways that we define them. It's not just talking about naked seeds or covered seeds. There's other anatomy that we use to distinguish these organisms, but this is the biggest, this is the most straightforward difference between them. This is why their names define this difference in seed, and this is what we're going to appreciate as we move forward. So looking now at this timeline, there's a lot going on in this timeline. We're going to revisit it a couple times, so don't get too overwhelmed. All that I'm worrying about right now is we can see down here at the bottom, we have our timeline depicted in units of millions of years, because this is not only how far back in time we have to go to appreciate when this process began, but we have to appreciate how long it took for this process. This is through the beauty of evolution. These things do not happen very quickly. They do not happen in a handful of generations. This occurred over very long periods of time. We have to go over 300 million years back before we get to the Carboniferous area, where in fact the gymnosperms first develop and thrive. This is a world dominated by the gymnosperms, as they have managed to evolve vascular tissue and rise higher and higher into the air. They shape the landscapes. We now have forests, which was a novel concept at the time for all intents and purposes. And we can appreciate that there is this gap. We have gymnosperms in the Carboniferous period, and it's several million years later in the Triassic-Jurassic period where we note the rise of angiosperms. And you will note there's debate about this, of where the true origin of angiosperms occur. We have two different data points here following two different lines of evidence. This is cool to point out simply to appreciate that this is ongoing science, as science is always ongoing. We are learning more every day. Every couple years, there seems to be a new fossil or a new insect or plant encased in amber that gives us a better appreciation of filling in this timeline accurately. The research is ongoing, and you better believe that there are some very lively debates within the botany community about exactly when this would have occurred and how it would have occurred. We're just going to go through a very quick, streamlined expression of decades of research on the part of scientists all over the world. Part of the reason this research occurs all over the world is because these fossils and these amber resin organisms that we find are found scattered all over the place. Part of the reason for this is this far back in time, we still have Pangea. And so we have a lot of examples of interaction between organisms that was happening very directly and in the same area that over time has spread out with the reshaping of the continents. And so we have examples of researchers in Russia, in Asia, in South and North America, in Europe. And these are all different data points that end up enforcing each other. And so we get that appreciation of the work of humans globally to try and understand and appreciate this timeline. Let's start talking about the plants themselves. So we're in this age, we have this landscape familiar lush with plants, but no flowering plants, no angiosperms. And so how far back exactly did this transition? We do know it seems that angiosperms developed from gymnosperms. So we had gymnosperms with their naked seeds that, for various reasons, slowly changed and shifted and developed into what we now know as angiosperms. Here's one of the earliest examples that we have found so far. The names associated with these pictures I'm going to show you, such as this Nangiganthus, this is the genus that has been given to this extinct plant. And so anytime you see that single name, I'm referring to the genus that it has been identified with. This is a fossil that exists. If we're looking this far back in time, it's almost exclusively fossils that we're looking at, which is amazing. It's amazing that these exist. It's amazing that we can learn so much from them, but there are very real limitations when looking at fossils. The big one of those is that fossils have gone through a process in which they are fully mineralized. We can't scrape DNA. We can't get genetic samples off of a fossil. So it's a lot more looking and using very clever and complex techniques to try and understand, what are we looking at? Why did it take on the shape in this rock that it did? We're looking at a very flat two-dimensional thing. How can we extrapolate to appreciate what this would have looked like in three-dimensional form? And so sure enough, as you can see on the right, we have an artist rendition of this. This is considered one of the earliest fossils of an angiosperm. This is one of the earliest flowers that we have found. And the number one reason that we define it as a flower, that we consider it to be an angiosperm, is this closed capsule that we notice at the bottom, replicated over here. This is in fact what we think a carpel. This would have been the enclosed space where the ovaries are, and where ultimately fertilization in this plant would occur and seeds and fruit would develop. Moving a little further forward in time, here's another example. Again, the challenge of working with these fossils is that they are mineral. We can't very actively understand exactly who was this plant, who was it related to, what lineage are we looking at. That's much more challenging, but sure enough, we can still manage that. There's a lot of fascinating forensic work that goes on, not only to understand how could this thing have actually looked in three-dimensional space, but then to try and associate it to something. What is the closest example of a fossil that we, or not, what is the closest example of a plant that we can extract DNA from, and compare and contrast and think, okay, maybe this is similar. Where was this found based off the geography? What else do we know was growing in this area, to try and place these fossils within a lineage so that we can create a better timeline. Here's another example. We're still over 100 million years in the past, but we're ever slowly moving forward. And we're seeing much more varied forms of plant bodies. But we're also seeing varied forms of flowers, but we're still thinking of them as flowers because we keep finding these structures that have completely closed off spaces within them, oftentimes near their base. And so we identify these sometimes much more confidently, sometimes a little more hesitantly, as carpels. This very specialized anatomy that helps us define flowering plants, angiosperms. I don't have a closer image on this, but this was a fascinating example because this wasn't just a single flower that they had found. This was a rare example of almost the entire body of this plant. And they were able to find many, many little examples of these enclosed structures all along the tips of these branches. So a very early, tiny little flower that we're looking at. And so jump forward millions of years, and here we are in the present. This is a very simple anatomical illustration of flowers today. Of course, there's many different variations of flowers. This example is what we would call a perfect flower. A perfect flower is one that has both male and female anatomy. It can give pollen and receive pollen and produce seeds and fruit. There's a huge variety of plants and plant strategies today, even among flowering plants. And so we have some species that have perfect flowers that have male and female parts on every flower. We have some species of plants that have separated and have male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. We have some species of plants that have separated so that you have exclusively male plants that produce pollen and female plants that make flowers to receive that pollen. It runs the full gamut. But what we can appreciate here in this model is this central point. We have the carpel made up of these various parts. The stigma is simply the tip of this appendage, which is meant to receive pollen. Microscopically, pollen has very coarse, spindly little hairs. It looks very much like Velcro. And so pollen will attach to that stigma. There is a chemical signaling that pollen knows I'm in the right place. And then it begins to use a bit of nutrition that it has to grow a root-like tube, a small, thin hair. And it will grow that tube all the way down the style, looking for the ovaries. And it will grow that tube into one of these ovaries in order to join that genetic material and fertilize those ovules and create seeds. The biggest thing I want to appreciate about this visual is that the carpel in modern plants to this day is fully enclosed. You do not see the ovaries. You do not see individual ovules when you are looking at one of these plants. They are protected. And so there's a lot of complex anatomy that is developed in order to not only better protect that ever precious next generation, but since it's protected, since it's not open to the air, and since pollen can't easily get in, and so that sperm cannot easily fertilize those eggs, there's a lot of anatomy on these modern flowers to account for that and allow that to happen. And that's not only just the stamen, the male pollen-producing part, and the carpel, the female part of the flower, but all the other things we're familiar with, like the petals and the sepals, these very showy, flashy things. Also, nectaries. All of these meant to entice organisms, entice pollinators who do the work of pollination. By pollination, we mean moving that pollen from one plant to another, moving that pollen from a stamen to a carpel so that reproduction can occur. And so you better believe that those plants, these fossils of very early angiosperms that we were looking at, they were not sorry, I was muted there for a sec. These early angiosperms had help. They weren't just changing from gymnosperms to angiosperms on their own. This is a prime example of coevolution. Looking back at our timeline here, we can appreciate we have the gymnosperms again in the Carboniferous period. And right afterward, again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years, but in between when the gymnosperms reign supreme and angiosperms start showing up in the Triassic and Jurassic period, right in between that period, there is a huge spike in insect diversity. Suddenly, a lot of different insect families that we're very familiar with today start showing up on the scene. In this visual, we have 4 listed. Coleoptera is beetles. Diptera is flies. Lepidoptera, we're all familiar with, moths and butterflies. And Hymenoptera, which contains the diversity of things we're familiar with, ants, wasps, bees. And so we see a huge explosion of diversity in insects right before, right around the same time that we see an explosion in the diversity of flowering plants. Here is one of the earliest fossil examples we have found of an insect interacting with plants. This is a now extinct insect that, looking at this fossil, we found it covered in small clumps of pollen. Now, this is a fascinating challenge because, again, this is a fossil, so we can't pull DNA off of it. So how did we know that that's pollen? How do we know that those little grains on this insect fossil are pollen? Essentially, by looking at it. This work was specifically done by a group in Russia. They had to create specialized tools, tiny little picks and microscopic spoons to ever so gently scrape these little bundles off of this insect fossil in order to look at them more closely under a microscope. And essentially, everything about how they visually appear matches up with how modern pollen today visually appears under a microscope. So these pollen have, again, been fully fossilized. We can't test them to see exactly what they are. But purely from visual comparison, we are very confident that this is pollen. And so on the right, we have an artist's rendition of what this might have looked like. Essentially, all that we know that we have here is an insect covered in pollen. And so we know that this probably wasn't a mistake because this also isn't the only example of this insect covered in pollen that we found. So there seems to be an interaction, a relationship going on here. We can safely hypothesize that this insect probably figured out that pollen is a really good food source. It's very high in protein, and it won't run away from you. So it's pretty easy to get your hands on it. And we can safely imagine that through happenstance, this organism would go from one plant to the next, eating more pollen, unintentionally covering its body in pollen, and therefore unintentionally moving that pollen for the plant, which probably otherwise relied on that pollen to be moved by wind. But the actions of an insect are much more directed. There's that intention gives a greater guarantee to the plant that it will become pollinated. And so we're familiar with this. We're familiar with the idea of pollen, and it's a pretty easy, it feels very reasonable as to why this interaction would happen, even though initially it would have happened presumably by chance, by happenstance. It just so happened to work out that way, and it just so happened to be a very successful strategy for both of these organisms. Moving a little forward in time to just over 100 million years ago, if we can wrap our minds around that. Around this time period, we start to get more and more examples of insects encased in amber resin. This is a game changer because these organisms are not fossilized. They are preserved, almost perfectly preserved, which means we can get DNA off them. And so now more than ever, we not only can really definitively figure out what insect this was, we know that this is a species of fly that used to exist, but we can find that pollen as depicted in the illustration in the center. We found all of these little flecks on its abdomen. We were able to cut into this amber, take little samples of those flecks, test their DNA, and confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is pollen from a plant. This is a species of fly that was visiting a conifer. And again, we have our artist depiction here. This is even more fascinating because this fly has a very specialized mouth. This looks very similar to what we today would probably identify as a proboscis. This is something that bees have. This is something that wasps or that butterflies and moths have. It's a tube-like mouth meant for pulling up liquid, particularly nectar from flowers. And so what nectar could this fly have been given? Because this far in the past, we don't find angiosperms. We don't think angiosperms existed, so we don't think there were flowers. And if there weren't flowers, there wasn't nectar attracting insects to those flowers. So why would this fly have this mouth, this hyper specialized mouth? Well, it turns out that a lot of gymnosperms it's not nectar in the way that we think of it, but it is sticky substances. Oftentimes, it's easy to make water sticky by adding sugar to it. And plants are great at making sugar through photosynthesis. And so, in fact, we believe this far in the past, there were many gymnosperms that would produce sticky substances to help ensure that pollen would stick where it needed to stick. We think this is a safe hypothesis because this still occurs today. Again, we have many examples of gymnosperms that have existed for millions of years, and there are many species of gymnosperm today that produce sweet, sticky substances in order to allow pollen on the wind to more effectively stick where they need it to in order for that sperm to be transferred from the pollen. So we think that this was a fly that figured out how to take advantage of those sticky substances, and again, just so happened to get some pollen on it as it moved from one plant to another. This is wild because we can appreciate, even in this situation, this hyper-specialized mouth, this tube-like mouth for pulling in liquid, would have required countless generations in order to evolve. So this, we think, or to the best of our understanding, this is the earliest example of the evolution of a pollinator. This is an organism that, through adaptation and evolution, has changed its body to specialize to the plants that it is feeding off of. However, both this species of fly and the gymnosperm that the pollen on its body, the gymnosperm that the pollen on its body came from, both of these species we now know are extinct. And so this is an example of pollination as a strategy that we think evolved and then for whatever reason was completely lost to extinction. We have to go several more million years in the future before we get really solid evidence of pollination going on. And not only solid evidence of pollination, but evidence that we can track from this point on. So we actually think at this point that pollination as a process, as an interaction between plants and insects, has occurred twice on our planet. This is the one that we would be most familiar with. This is the second development of pollination that has persisted to this day. This is a amber. This is a piece of amber with many, many little beetles trapped in it. And you can see in the illustration below the image all of those little red dots. And sure enough, once we tested those, we could confirm that those were pollen. More specifically, we could confirm that this is pollen of an early ancestor of a water lily plant. And so we have a species of beetle that we can identify and trace its lineage, and we have a species of a plant that has also hyper-specialized to these beetles. It has flowers. It has special structures to attract these beetles, to cover them in pollen, allowing them to transfer that pollen when they move to the next flower. And so, again, there is debate. There's new fossil evidence and new amber samples coming out all the time. But as of my research making this presentation, this is the earliest form we have found that verifies pollination as we understand it. This is a chart just kind of trying to really encapsulate everything that we were just talking about. We can see on the left, from the left to the right, on the y-axis, we are moving through time closer to the present day. And so we are seeing these shadows of different insects, different families or groups of insects. And we can see how at first there were certain species that we found in association with gymnosperms. And then later in time, as angiosperms, as flowering plants develop, we saw different insects interacting and relating to those. One of the only families that through our evidence ties this line is Coleoptera, the beetles. So as far as we can tell, beetles have been at work interacting with these plants for as long as they've been around. Looking at the three main groups or families of insects presented here, this top one, Primopsacida, if I'm saying that right, is extinct at this point. However, Coleoptera, beetles, and Hymenoptera, wasps and ants and bees, still exist to this day. And so these are very old relationships that we have going on. Add in Lepidoptera, the moths and the butterflies, and Diptera, the flies, and these four families of insects now dominate this role that we define as pollinators. These, more than any other organisms on Earth, are the ones that, through adaptation and evolution, have hyper specialized to take advantage of food that flowering plants provide. And since I'm a beekeeper, let's talk a little bit more about bees. We can trace the lineage of bees pretty accurately at this point. We get more and more examples of their distant ancestors encased in resin or amber resin like this as time goes on. Through these examples, we have been able to chart and figure out that bees, as we understand them today, are the distant relatives of solitary hunting wasps. So bees came from wasps. We can see through these pictures here, we not only appreciate through taking genetic samples this development, this change, but we can see to some physical extent changes that are going on. As evolution changed these organisms over millions of years, it did a couple things. It made them hairier. And we appreciate that to this day. Wasps, as we know them, are bald. They look very shiny because they have clean exoskeletons. Bees, on the other hand, their exoskeleton is covered in hair. We also see their mouth parts changing. We get less and less of the biting, shredding mandibles that you would expect from a wasp that is hunting other organisms for prey. And we see more and more of the specialization of the mouth towards pulling nectar out of flowers, growing those proboscis, getting that special straw mouth that we're familiar with. And we can imagine this the same as other early insects, that these hunting wasps who are finding and hunting down other insects, stinging them to consume them themselves or bring them back to their nest to feed their young. We can imagine that somewhere along the line, they got a taste of pollen and appreciated, oh, this is good protein and it's way easier to get than hunting down other insects. And so we had wasps over time selecting pollen over hunting other insects more and more, and thus this transition into the modern hyper-specialized organism that is bees that we know of today. Essentially, the encapsulation of all this is we know that bees are wasps that decided to become vegetarian. And here are some examples of modern bees today. Look at how hairy they are. This is an incredibly important adaptation. We've probably seen examples of this before. These hairs are not only covering their body, but they're branched. It makes them very easy to grab onto anything that comes into contact with it. Like, for example, pollen. So if you're hairy, you just so happen to get a lot more pollen on your body without you even trying. You don't have to put any effort into collecting this pollen. All you have to do is walk around on a flower and get great. An easy thing to appreciate of why would this evolve? Why would we see this change happening? Another important change that we see on bees is anatomy on their bodies, specially made for packing in that pollen. It's one thing to cover it all over your body with your hair, but you actually have to collect it and store it. We can see on this picture of this bee's leg, we have these long hairs that curve in toward the leg. We also, it's hard to see in this picture, but this bee's leg is indented. There's a cavity here that it can pack pollen into. And so as it flies around, it can use its legs to clean this pollen off of its body, scrape it off, and push it down and pack it onto its legs for easier transport. All bees that we see today have this. It's not always in the same spot on their body, but they have some part of their anatomy that is basically changed and specially made to carry pollen. And in the case of honeybees, bringing it back and storing it in their hive for eating later. Oh, and this is just some different colored pollen I found in my hive one day. Now we have those mouth parts, those specialized mouth parts. They have mandibles, but not multiple sets of them. They're not ready to shred other organisms up. They have these long tubes that we call a proboscis. It's essentially a straw. It's a hollow tube that is meant to suck up nectar and water, but mostly the nectar that can be found at the base of flowers. All of those frilly bits on the end there, that's just more surface area to absorb more of that nectar and get it into your body faster. So this hyper specialized piece of anatomy that exclusively exists so that bees can take advantage of flowers. So that was a lot, but here we have two very modern organisms that through millions of years of interaction and evolution have hyper specialized to each other. And once that union formed, they have taken off. Here are three modern plants. We have, this is a rose flower, a daffodil, and a zucchini, but we still have examples of this closed carpel at the bottom. It's been cut away so that you can see the undeveloped seeds in there. But this structure exists to this day. Everything above that is just show. It's meant to attract these pollinators. So these big, beautiful, colorful flowers that we see, this is a relatively modern thing in the evolution. The earliest insects that were visiting these plants didn't have very big, showy petals to show them the way. Petals are very pretty and showy to us. I have all these pictures here so that we can appreciate that bees actually see things differently. In the human eye, we have cones to register different colors. We have cones to register red, green, and blue light. Bees and other pollinators have cones to register green, blue, and ultraviolet light. And so all of these pictures show on the left-hand side what we humans see with our naked eye, and on the right hand, what these flowers look like under UV light, giving us a better idea of what bees and other pollinators are seeing. And so we see examples where these, oftentimes the nectar is a very different color than the rest of the plant. So we can see that bees can even more easily hone in on where they need to get to. We also have the development of nectaries, of water mixed with a little bit of sugar from photosynthesis to better entice these organisms to come visit flowers and move pollen around. On the left is just a cutaway of a flower to see the nectaries at the base. Oftentimes the nectaries are at the base of the flower to help guarantee that a pollinating insect has to move past the pollen, has to move past the male and female parts of the plant in order to get to the reward of the nectar, thus increasing the chances of pollination. Many plants also produce extrafloral nectaries. They're making nectar on their stems, on their leaves, or on parts of their body that aren't their flowers to just help guarantee that there are always pollinators around. That way, when you're ready to make flowers, there's already a bunch of insects there ready to do the work of pollination for you. So this is an ancient relationship going on. For millions of years, these organisms have been at work, interacting with each other, adapting, evolving, specializing to each other to make it better and better for the other. And now, in this modern day, we have a world dominated by flowering plants. Angiosperms represent the vast majority of plants on every continent. They are not the dominant species of plant on Antarctica, but they do exist in Antarctica. And on every other landmass, angiosperms are the dominant form of plants. Their diversity knows no bounds. Their interaction with pollinators, with bees and other insects, has allowed them to spread far and wide into every nook and cranny that we can imagine. And you better believe that with that huge diversity of plants, there is a huge diversity of their insect partners. Almost as many insects, pollinators, as there are flowering plants exist on Earth. Many of these pollinators go to a lot of different plants. However, we have many, many examples of hyperspecialization. Sometimes we have a single species of pollinating insect that pollinates a single species of plant, or maybe only one genus, one particular group of plants. And so we have every possible interaction going on to help guarantee that these plants are getting the pollination that they need, and these organisms who have sacrificed a lot through evolution in specializing themselves to these flowering plants to make sure that they get all of the food they need as well. Here is a family tree of bees. We're going closer to the modern day as we go up. At the top there, you see the 7 families of bees that we identify today. So this lineage has drastically diversified and increased over time and continues to this day. Why do we care about this? Well, of course, a big reason that we care about this is that these organisms have shaped the world we live in. They have not only physically shaped the land, they've created the environments that we exist in, but they've created almost all of the food in those environments that we depend on. Some of this is no doubt very familiar, like a flower on a tomato plant being pollinated and turning into a tomato. But we need to appreciate this includes any plant oil, which is just a product derived from fruit, and fruit only exists when pollination occurs. On the right-hand side here, I have some more abstracted things, not food, but things that we can appreciate, like cotton and flax that produces linen. So a lot of our clothing material ultimately is coming from angiosperms. In the bottom right there, we have the small inconspicuous flowers of an oak tree. And wood is a very important resource to humans. This is not to say we have ways of grafting and growing things from cuttings. So like we have ways to propagate plants without sexual reproduction. However, the only way that these angiosperms can sexually reproduce, can maintain genetic diversity and ultimately viability as organisms, the way that they can continue to exist, producing generation after generation, is through their interaction with these insects, is through this loving relationship that they have formed with pollinators. And so we need to appreciate that this relationship has shaped our world. And the vast majority of resources that we as humans are dependent on collecting from our environments is the direct or indirect product of pollinating insects interacting with flowering plants. Bringing it a little closer to home, Maryland here. It's no different here than it is on the global scale. We have thousands of plants that are considered native to Maryland. A huge diversity from the smallest little tiny flowers staying close to the ground to huge, big, showy things, to trees, to vines, shrubs, you name it. I'm sure a lot of these pictures are very familiar to you. And again, if there's a huge diversity of flowering plants, you better believe there's a huge diversity of insects to work with those. And in this image here, I've really narrowed it down. We could talk about the hundreds and hundreds, the thousands of species of different insects that are pollinators in our area and in the US collectively. In Maryland alone, we have over 400 species of bee, these hyper specialized organisms. And again, these are examples. Some of these bees only pollinate a single species of plant. Some of them are much more ubiquitous and will interact with a lot of different plants. Each of these pictures I have here is a category. In parentheses, I have the Latin name, and you'll notice there is the genus for each of them, and then this SPP abbreviation. That abbreviation simply means plural, multiple species. And so each of these pictures is representing a whole group. Dozens and dozens of species of bees fall into each of these categories. You might notice at the bottom, there is one type of bee that there's only one species, Apis mellifera, that is the honeybee. And that is simply because honeybees are not from North America. Humans brought them here as we traveled, as we brought them everywhere that we've traveled in the world. So that is one unique case where there's only one type of honeybee here, and it's the one that we brought with us. But it just is a drop in the bucket of diversity of these organisms. Most native bees are solitary, so it's very hard to find them in the first place. They're not like honeybees that will have tens of thousands of individuals in a colony. It is like one female raising a small clutch of eggs each year. So they're solitary and they're very small. Many of these bees could fit on my thumbnail. So they're very hard to find if we're not looking for them. This is an illustration trying to lay out this spread of different bee species again. This specifically was produced through Penn State. So this is representing bees in Pennsylvania, but you better believe there's a lot of overlap between the bees that we have here in Maryland and in Pennsylvania. A huge diversity. These organisms are everywhere. Everywhere that you see flowers, there are bees, whether you notice them or not. And so we can appreciate that these organisms shape our world, whether it's the wild fields or forests that we appreciate, to the manicured landscapes, the gardens, the farms that produce our field, our backyards where we just want to have flowers for beauty. The world as we know it exists because of flowering plants. And the only reason flowering plants exist is because millions of years ago, a varied group of insects decided to partner up with them and really commit to this beautiful mutualistic coexistence. Yeah, mind-blowing. That was a lot. I appreciate. Thanks for sticking with me. That was a real crash course. We ran as quickly as we could through millions of years. But again, my intention more than anything was to just blow your minds. It blows my mind every time I think about it, and it gives me endless appreciation as I travel through the world. Not only as I'm out in nature appreciating all the beautiful plants and the landscapes that they have shaped, but any time that I sit down to any meal, I can give thanks to this beautiful association, this partnership that we know of as pollination that these organisms have formed. So yeah, that's all I had for you tonight. I'm happy to keep talking if there's any questions. But otherwise, thank you for joining me.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? There's nothing in chat. I do have a question. There's a decline in a lot of types of insects and bees, right? And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's nothing. I'm sure we're all very familiar with it. I don't have much very new to say on the topic, but it is simply the main reason we're seeing a decline in pollinating insects, and particularly in bees, is loss of habitat. When natural ecosystems are left to their own devices, plants grow everywhere, and the vast majority of those plants today are angiosperms, and so flowers are growing everywhere. However, as much as humans love flowers and very actively fill certain spaces with them, we very actively remove them from many, many more spaces. Even a field that doesn't look like it has a lot of very showy flowers is filled with angiosperms that are blooming all throughout the year at various stages. And that is always a crucial food source for countless pollinators, including bees. It also ends up being habitat. Sure enough, many of these bees try to stay very close to the plants that they feed off of. And so as we lose these plants, as we remove them from our landscapes and our ecosystems, we inevitably see fewer and fewer bees. This is especially alarming for species that have hyperspecialized. There are examples where if we lose this species of flowering plant, we are guaranteed to lose the species of bee that has hyperspecialized to feed only off of that plant. And so there are very alarming examples like that where we could very quickly lose species to extinction. And even for species of bee and other pollinators that can search much broader and collect from a variety of plants, it's just the reality that the more diversity of plants we take away, the more diversity of food we take away. Not only abundance of food for them, but diversity of nutrition. The pollen and nectar in different species of plant has different chemical compositions. And so just like us, bees are healthiest when they have a diverse diet. if I eat the same vegetables are good for me, but if I eat nothing but broccoli day in and day out, I'm going to get sick. I'm not going to get all of my essential nutrients. And it's the same with bees. It's great to have some plants that flower a lot and flower for a very long period of the year. However, that one species of flowering plant has a very specific breakdown of nutrients that it can offer to bees. And so in order for bees to be as healthy as possible, they need to be visiting a wide variety of plants. And so the more plants and the more diversity, the better for the bees. And the more that humans develop and remove flowering plants from the ecosystem, the more that these organisms that are essentially permanently bonded to them through evolution, we're going to lose them too. There's also, of course, concerns about other human activities, such as the use of poisons, of pesticides, really any side. CIDE as an ending just translates to poison. So herbicide is poison for plants, insecticide is poison for insects, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes, pesticides, insecticides are sold to us advertised for very specific pests to say, oh, this will get rid of spiders for you, or this will get rid of ants for you. Oftentimes, these chemical poisons are much more broad spectrum than they are advertised. They are knocking out a lot more than the one or two insect that they advertise on the label. And sure enough, even in the example of like, if you're spreading something to try and get rid of the ants, ants are in the group of insects identified as Hymenoptera, which is the same one that bees are in. So they're very closely related. So something that's going to poison ants, it's absolutely going to poison bees. And so any amount that we're putting this out into our landscapes, it's detrimental to these organisms. Again, I doubt any of that is completely new news to anybody here, but it's important to point to. Thank you for bringing it up, Patty.
Okay. A related question, how's climate change affecting pollinators?
Great question. It is varied, as we will see in all organisms on Earth as climate change continues. Some of them are going to handle the change a lot more easily. In the case of pollinators, the ones that are going to do best are likely going to be the ones that can really diversify the plants that they collect from. Honeybees, for example, are incredibly good at collecting nectar and pollen from pretty much any flowering plant that they can find. They don't hyper specialize at all. So while there are concerns about the health of honeybees right now, long term, thinking about the effects of climate change, I think honeybees are going to do a lot better in the long run than many other species of insects. Some of these bees that we're talking about are very, very small, so small that they can't handle extreme temperature shifts. And so changing temperatures, it getting much hotter might be enough for us to lose those species. Some of them are so small that they cannot travel very far. Many tiny species of insects, including bees, do not travel a great distance in their entire lifetime. And so if conditions drastically change suddenly, whether that's increasing temperatures, changes in humidity, these changes prompting changes in plant composition, potentially plants can move a lot farther by dropping their seeds than bees can. And so we might see shifts where, as our climate warms up and changes, we're going to see certain plants slowly kind of moving north, and other ones flourishing more in this area. Bees may not necessarily, some small bees may not necessarily be able to move as easily with their host plants as the climate changes to find better conditions to acclimate to, and we might lose them for that reason. It is definitely a concern. And again, this is nothing new for any of us, I'm sure, but what it ultimately translates to is that as we see increased climate change, we're going to see a drop in diversity. Not everybody's going to make it, and that is to everyone's detriment.
Okay, we have a couple other questions. You want me to keep going?
Please.
Okay, this is a little longer. I assume that when you say the organisms decided to become partners, you don't literally mean decided. Could you speak a little about how evolution works, which I think is based upon chance events that lead to greater survival?
Absolutely correct. A great point and a perfect example of where we're talking about things both in their concept and in their scale of time that are very, very difficult for us as humans to grasp. The mammalian organisms that we are, for our survival and our reproduction, we simply don't need to be able to comprehend what was happening millions of years ago. So that's challenging in and of itself. And as you will see in many fields of science that are really pushing at the barriers of our understanding and what we're able to conceptualize, we use metaphor and we use poetic language, and we anthropomorphize things. We make them seem more human-like so that we can hopefully understand them better. So you're absolutely right that when I'm saying, for example, that bees are wasps that decided to become vegetarian, there was no council of bees millions of years ago that assembled and communicated with each other and decided that they were going to make this behavioral change. This is even more mind-blowingly, this is the product of happenstance, as you point out. This is the decisions of countless individuals in their environments, in their times, simply deciding like, oh, this is to my benefit. Let me eat this pollen. Let me go for this instead of something else. Oh, that really worked out for me. I'm going to do the same thing tomorrow. And then that behavior being successful enough that either through education or some other means, it gets passed on to another generation, that behavior becomes more likely to occur. And both of those organisms benefit, so they continue to do well. There are many, as is the case in all evolution, there are many examples of things that we truly think are happenstance. Nectar, for example. We don't think it's not as if plants decided, wow, it's really great when insects come and move my pollen around. I should make some nectar so that they're more likely to come around. We don't understand where nectar first originated in plants at this point, but we can imagine that it was happenstance. We have examples again of like gymnosperms that were creating a nectar-like substance to help attract pollen that's moved on the wind. So that might be the origin of nectar, and plants just adapted and changed their use for that sugary water that they were making. But yeah, these are all ultimately examples of just countless individuals in their lifetimes making choices, those choices leading to greater and greater success and health for them. Some of those choices being powerful enough and ingrained in them in such ways that it can be passed on to the next generation. And over the course of countless generations, we see the change that we do today. Again, to appreciate, I can very casually say like, oh yeah, wasps decided to be vegetarian and only eat nectar and pollen. But I'm being poetic in that sense to say, when I say that they decided, what I'm saying is that over the course of hundreds of millions of years, individuals made decisions that led to greater and greater success and prompted evolution to favor those behaviors and the anatomy that would help those beneficial behaviors. Mind-blowing.
Okay, the next question is, what do you grow on your farm and where is it?
Well, I live up in Thurmont, so that's where I farm personally. I've worked at a variety of farms throughout Maryland and Frederick County. A few years ago, I was working at Fox Haven Farm out in Jefferson, Western Frederick County. highly recommend anybody get out there. I was managing their fruit, nut, and herb orchard system that they have up there. I grow a lot of different things. I grow some things that aren't native because I like them and they're beautiful, and pollinators have learned to like them. But as much as possible, I try and grow native things. And this is for all the reasons that I'm sure y'all are familiar with, prioritizing native plants, and that is simply because they've been here a long time, and the other organisms that are here have had a long time to form relationships with them. Bees are a prime example of that. If I want to have a diversity of native bees in my yard or on my farm helping to pollinate all of my crops, I can't necessarily guarantee that they're going to go for just any flower that is growing out there. If I want those native bees, I have to have the native plants that I know they have over countless generations evolved and formed these intimate relationships with. Aside from that, we could be here all night talking about specific plants of like, oh, grow this, it's great for the bees, or this or that. The biggest recommendation that I can give is to grow a diversity, because again, bees need a diverse diet. So if you can have a diversity of flowers at any given time, that's really beneficial for the bees. And also importantly, I am making sure that there is always something blooming. If I want bees to exist and thrive year long in my yard, I need to make sure that they have food year long. And so anywhere that I'm gardening, farm, backyard, whatever the case, if there is a certain time of year where I notice there's nothing blooming or there's very little blooming, that's a red flag for me. That immediately sends me on the track of doing research to understand what plants are flowering this time of year that I can incorporate into my system to make sure that there is always nectar and pollen available for bees. So whatever you want to plant, have it be a diversity of flowering things and have it be a diversity year long, and the bees will come.
Okay, one more question. Can you recommend any books written for non-scientists that address the topic of your presentation tonight?
Oh, sure. Just of the relationship between pollinators and plants in general. Oh, I am going to forget the author's name. I can probably search it real quick. There's a fascinating book, focus a little more on human development, but particularly in the beginning of it, it has really good information just speaking to this interaction and how this interaction allowed human civilization to take off, essentially. That the basis of agriculture comes from flowering plants that already had formed relationships with insects, again, millions of years ago. It's important to appreciate this huge diversity, interaction of flowering plants and pollinators. Figured it out millions of years before humans even showed up on the scene. So they completely shaped the world before we even showed up. I think I'm seeing a note here for coevolution specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I have some old books that I can recommend. And I could give some resources that you could share later on. There's a book that's just called Coevolution of Animals and Plants. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's notes dictated from a symposium that happened years ago. Let me look that up. Yes, that is by Peter Raven and Lawrence Gilbert. Coevolution of Animals and Plants. It's an old one, but it's great. It's dense with this information. It's very science heavy, but very palatable. Again, like I'm not a professional scientist, so I I appreciated having this book. Again, it's an older one, but it's all very good information. And old book just means it's very easily accessible. You can get it pretty cheaply if you go online these days. So that's one that I recommend. I can put out a resource list later because obviously there's much more out there.
And then one final question, what journals are most up to date with the historical research you mentioned?
That's a good question. There are a lot of journals that get into this. There's just so many journals out there, and most of them like hyper specialized in their topic. So it's not like you can go looking for like the 3 botany journals that are out there. There are dozens and dozens of journals on botany that hyper specialize in this or that. In terms of when I'm looking for research, like peer-reviewed research on these things, most of these pictures, particularly these photos and illustrations of fossils that I have found, these are coming straight from research articles that I have found. I do not subscribe to any specific journals, so I don't have a single one to recommend. I usually go straight through just the internet. I'll start by Googling. There are a couple websites, and it sounds like I really need to put out a resource guide, so I'll include those. There are several websites that do a really good job of assembling a wide diversity of research out there on a topic for you and kind of giving it to you in easily accessible article form and link it to the journal so that like, oh, did you like this little snippet? Well, here's the journal where it came from. So I'm perusing a lot of different journals all the time. Frustratingly, a lot of journals are stuck behind paywalls. That is another reason that I tend not to recommend specific journals, because they expect you to pay an exorbitant amount of money just to read about cool science stuff. I will say, though, I have had very good, if you're this into it and you want to read these articles that are behind a paywall, I recommend that if you find something and you are not given access to it, or you're expected to pay for it through a journal or through a website, you can, for free, usually at least get the title of the research paper and the name of the author. From there, I will find that person online. More often than not, they're just teaching at a university somewhere. And if you can find this person at the university that they teach at, and you shoot them an email and you say, hi, I'm just somebody who's very interested in your work. Could you please send me a PDF, or could you please explain it to me? These scientists are used to hyper specialized work in the field of the laboratories. They're used to maybe a couple of their peers reading their papers and finding it interesting. 9 times out of 10, when I find a research article that's behind a paywall, I just go find the author and send them a simple message to say, I'm very interested in your work. Could you please share it with me? And they are over the moon. They not only will give you PDFs for free, but they'll very often happily talk to you or say, like, here's my research. Please hit me up if you have any questions about it. So that is the path that I take more often than not in finding and exploring research. And so I would recommend that. I don't have any specific journals that I subscribe to that I can espouse.
Okay, that finishes all the questions. Taylor, I'd like to really thank you for joining us tonight. That was really interesting, and obviously everybody enjoyed listening to it and had lots of questions. Before we leave, I'd like to let you know that our next webinar is on September 4th. It's Gemma Radko of the American Bird Conservancy, and she is going to be discussing bird migration. And this is Jake, he just woke up. There you go. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.